Thanks for joining everyone today. I think I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. Hello to everyone in the chat, and thank you so much for being here. So we're joining our third webinar of the Ocean Climate Solutions Innovation Exchange. And if this is your first time joining us, the Innovation Exchange is an initiative of the Ocean Vision's UN Decade Collaborative Center for Ocean Climate Solutions. We're a thematic collaborative center of the UN Ocean Decade, working to advance recognition that the world's oceans hold huge untapped potential to act as a tool for climate change mitigation. The Innovation Exchange is one of our initiatives that uses online and in-person events to bring emerging innovations in ocean science and technology to a broader international and public audience, improve ocean literacy in this area, and most importantly, hear from the people who are working on the cutting edge across science, technology, and policy every day about what is needed to advance the field of ocean-based climate mitigation. So we are hosted at Ocean Visions, which is a field building network organization advancing the research, development, and policy frameworks needed to mitigate climate change through ocean ecosystem repair, emissions reduction, and ocean-based carbon removal, which is what we're talking about today. So my name is Liliana Bastian. I'm a program officer at Ocean Visions, and I'm based with our partners here at the Georgia Aquarium. And I work on our engagements with the UN Decade of Ocean Science. So I will give some really brief context on today's topic. We've been so excited about this, and apparently so is everyone else. We are sold out for this webinar, so we really appreciate you being here today to learn about this area of science. One of Ocean Vision's focus areas is ocean-based carbon dioxide removal, or CDR, which is a relatively emerging field, which also means that it's full of exciting ideas, science, and innovation, as well as getting a lot of attention and building momentum recently in the funding and policy worlds. So audiences from our past Innovation Exchange webinars expressed really strong interest in the topic of measurement, reporting, and verification, or MRV, for ocean-based CDR. So if you're brand new to this topic, this is going to be a great primer. And if you're already working in the field, you'll also benefit from the very current insights of the experts who have kindly joined us today. This is also the first of two webinars on MRV. The second one will dig a little bit deeper into the science and learn what a couple of startups in this space are doing. So if you'd like to learn even more after this, please stay tuned. From here, we will get started. We'll have two 15-minute presentations from our speakers, followed by about 20 to 25 minutes for a moderated Q&A. And because we have so many people online today, we'll do Q&A through the chat. And so throughout the webinar, as questions come up for you, please put them in the chat, and my colleagues at Ocean Visions are going to kindly collate and curate those questions for an informative and efficient Q&A, which is typically a mix of technical and sort of overarching questions for our speakers. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted to Ocean Vision's YouTube channel shortly after. So today we have Freya Chay, Carbon Removal Program Lead at CarbonPlan, followed by Joanna Klitzke, who is Procurement and Ecosystem Strategy Lead at Frontier. So Freya, I'll hand it over to you to get started.
Great, thanks Liliana. And thanks everyone for being here. I'm excited to join you today. My name is Freya Chay, and I work at a research nonprofit called CarbonPlan. Broadly, our goal is to increase the transparency and the scientific integrity of climate solutions. And I lead our work specifically on emerging approaches to carbon removal. Today, I was invited to give a high-level introduction to MRV, for ocean-based carbon removal. And since I know we have a really wide range of folks in the room today, I'm going to start with some basic definitions. What is MRV? What is carbon removal? Why do we care? Then I'm going to spend a moment giving you a sense of what MRV might look like for different ocean-based carbon removal approaches. And I'm going to hand off to Joanna with 3 challenges that I see that I think really will require attention and investment from a lot of corners of the climate ecosystem and the ocean ecosystem in order to make MRV for ocean-based carbon removal effective. So first and foremost, what is MRV? Liliana already gave some groundwork here. You might hear the acronym MRV defined as Measurement, Reporting, and Verification, or Monitoring, Reporting, and Verification. But at a high level, the basic goal here is to create a process that produces trustworthy quantitative estimates of real-world outcomes and communicate those findings and their underlying methods in a consistent and transparent manner. Effective MRV has a couple of must-haves in my mind. It relies on us providing a really clear definition of which outcomes we care about. It relies on us using rigorous quantification methods such that we are actually estimating real-world outcomes to the best of our ability. And last but not least, we don't just want numbers at the end of the day. We also want to know how confident we are in those numbers. So MRV must include a clear characterization of our uncertainty. Today, we're talking about MRV for carbon removal specifically, which brings me to our next kind of foundational definition. What is carbon removal? I think a lot of people in the room today will be familiar with this, but to stabilize global temperatures, we all know we need to reach net zero emissions. So that means any CO2 we are putting into the atmosphere, we have to figure out how to take back out and store essentially permanently. High quality carbon removal has an important but pretty limited role here. In the graph to the right, you kind of see the classic representation of net zero. So the first priority for reaching net zero is always going to be reducing our emissions as much as possible. That's represented by that shaded yellow area in the graph. A second priority will be compensating for any emissions we can't get rid of with carbon removal. That's that pink area. And the net impact is shown by the yellow line. What I want to emphasize here is carbon removal is precious. We are just figuring out how to do it, let alone how to do it at the scale we think we might need. So yes, it has an important role in our net zero world. We need to start working on it. And also it should never come at the cost of really ambitious emission reductions. Carbon removal, it's not a single thing, it's rather a function. And there are a bunch of different approaches being explored to carbon removal. This schematic is from a resource called the CDR Primer, which I would really recommend as an introduction to this field. It is by no means a complete characterization of what people are exploring, but I think it captures the diversity. So over on the right of the schematic, you have approaches that rely on photosynthesis to take carbon out of the air and either store it in forests and soils or transform biomass to achieve longer duration carbon storage, for instance, in biochar. You have approaches like direct air capture that use kind of controlled chemical reactions to pull CO2 out of the air and produce a stream of CO2 that you can then store somewhere, for instance, back underground. You have approaches that rely on natural rock weathering, so reactions between rocks and water and air to pull CO2 out of the air and store it in basically water or in rock form. And last but not least, which is why we're here today, you have a bunch of approaches that involve the ocean. In ocean-based carbon removal, broadly, there are kind of 3 big buckets. First bucket relies on chemical pathways to leverage the ocean's ability to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere. So examples in that bucket are ocean alkalinity enhancement. So that's actually adding alkaline materials to the surface ocean that allow it to hold more carbon without acidifying. The second is direct ocean removal. So that's pulling CO2 out of the surface ocean, which leaves kind of empty space and allows the ocean to draw CO2 back out of the atmosphere to fill it. There are also biological pathways. Examples here are growing and sinking macroalgae. So you grow that macroalgae, it contains carbon in its biomass. If you sink it to the surface ocean, into the deep ocean, that might result in, depending on where you sink it, long-term carbon storage. But really, the atmospheric removal happens, again, via depleting surface ocean CO2 and exchange of carbon between the atmosphere and the surface ocean. Nutrient fertilization, again, is trying to use biomass growth in the surface ocean and increase export and carbon storage. The last bucket, is kind of a grab bag of approaches, but one thing I want to highlight is people are also exploring the possibility of things like terrestrial biomass sinking. So achieving kind of anoxic storage of biomass carbon. These are really different approaches. And we know that for any of them, we need to learn whether they will actually work. And we also need to understand what effects they would have on the ocean's really complex and interconnected ecosystems. And that is where the concept of MRV comes into play. To give you a sense of the complexity of MRV for some of these pathways, I want to share a tool called the CDR Verification Framework that we worked on actually in collaboration with the Stripe team, Joanna and Z. Kasfather. The CDR Verification Framework looks complicated when you land, but we're going to step through bit by bit. Fundamentally, this framework maps out systematically what MRV for different CDR pathways needs to include in order to quantify net carbon removal. Just want to caveat upfront, net carbon removal is only one piece of the puzzle here. For all ocean CDR approaches, we're going to want to also think a lot about other ecosystem impacts. We should not just view through the lens of carbon. But to give you a sense of the net carbon removal piece of the puzzle, I pulled up the pathway for ocean biomass sinking, where you are growing macroalgae and sinking it to the deep ocean. At first blush, you might think that it sounds kind of simple. You grow and harvest the macroalgae. We are pretty certain about what that is if you're harvesting it and quantifying how much carbon is there. You have to sink it. You might have some questions about what fraction of that biomass actually gets to depth. But really that main action that the project might do is a small piece of the puzzle. We need to think about surface competition effects. If you're growing something new in the surface ocean, what are the potential impacts of nutrient depletion or canopy shading? We need to think about actually when the atmosphere sees the difference. The macroalgae grows, but carbon is not removed from the atmosphere until the surface ocean takes CO2 back out of the atmosphere. We need to think about where that macroalgae sunk and how long it's going to stay down when that CO2 embodied by the macroalgae will outgas back to the atmosphere. And last but not least, you have to think about all of the upstream materials and energy associated with that project. This tool contains a handful of different ocean approaches. It's online, freely accessible. You might be interested to explore more here. But I maybe wanted to synthesize a couple of key challenges that I think any of these pathways are going to face. Before doing that, maybe just a snapshot, state of the ocean-based carbon removal market and ecosystem today. People are doing this stuff and exploring it. So there's quite a lot of private sector activity right now. There are startups emerging to actually perform ocean-based carbon removal and sell carbon credits. There are also buyers like Frontier, who you'll hear from next, buying those credits and trying to think about how to accelerate responsible action in this field. We've seen recent increased attention from governments around the need for policy, permitting, and regulatory standards for both researching and implementing this stuff. Not a lot of that exists yet, but we're seeing action in that direction. In a way that I'm really excited about, we're seeing growing quantity of really targeted cross-disciplinary research This is really important. As you see from that simple macroalgae example, you're touching a lot of different pieces of the puzzle with any of these approaches. We're going to really need to talk to each other on the research side of things to make sure we are asking the right questions with our MRV. And last but not least, I want to highlight that we're seeing some really interesting emerging nonprofit efforts to try to build tools that are rigorous and accessible in order to do MRV well. In all of these streams of work, a couple of key challenges. First, it's really hard to directly observe outcomes for most marine CDR approaches. We're still learning about the ocean, and many of these processes unfold over pretty large spatial and temporal scales. So that means together, it can be really hard to identify a signal from the noise of the ocean, especially when we're doing this stuff at small experimental scales, which is the appropriate phase to be doing them at right now. The implication here in a really interesting way is that models will have to play a central role in MRV for ocean-based carbon removal. And the key question is, how do we make sure those models are not black boxes, that they're based on the best available science, that they are widely accessible and used consistently. We have a lot of modeling resources in the ocean sciences community, but really bringing them to bear on this challenge will take a lot of work. The second challenge is really around scientific infrastructure. So we have a lot of ocean science. We have sensors, we have ways to think about ecosystem impacts, we have sampling techniques, we have existing observation networks. They're not necessarily usable off the shelf for MRV. And it's going to be really critical to kind of invest in that scientific infrastructure along investing in kind of deployment and startups and doing this stuff. One question I have here is, might there be an opportunity to harness all of this interest, both from the private sector and the government, in ocean-based carbon removal to really improve our understanding of the ocean? I think that would be a really fantastic outcome of investing in ocean-based MRV. Last key challenge is we need a lot of governance infrastructure that doesn't exist yet. So today, practitioners are operating and selling carbon removal tons, largely in the absence of established third-party scientific standards. I think there are a lot of thoughtful actors here, but that is not going to be a sustainable solution. Historically, carbon markets have not demonstrated adequate governance of our carbon cycle interventions. Happy to go into this more in discussion, but I think the call for action here is that we are going to need to do a lot of work as scientists, as policymakers, as entrepreneurs, to make sure that this emerging industry really remains grounded in evolving science. And the key question is, what governance structures will really ensure that our ongoing marine carbon removal deployments are both effective and safe for our oceans. With that, I'm going to hand off to Joanna, who's going to talk about how, as a buyer, they are trying to responsibly navigate those challenges and really call for high quality MRV for marine carbon dioxide removal.
Thanks, Freya. And awesome. And thank you, Ocean Visions, for having us. I'm Joanna Klitzke, and I work on carbon removal procurement and strategy at Frontier. We are an advanced market commitment to buy about $1 billion of carbon removal over the next decade across marine CDR, across a bunch of different approaches. And our North Star is really to support carbon removal at the ground floor today so that we can have it at the scale tomorrow when we need it in 2030 and 2050. And so I spend my time thinking about how we can best support carbon removal, including working with Freya and others on thinking around MRV and what that looks like. And so the perspective I would like to share today with this group is how we as an early buyer are thinking about the role of purchasing in supporting responsible marine carbon removal.
and then how we approach a few of those challenges that Freya mentioned. So to kick us off, where do we come from as Frontier? The motivation behind Frontier was a similar chart to the one that Freya shared, and the understanding that to really limit the most catastrophic impacts of climate change, including on marine ecosystems, we need to both rapidly reduce emissions and then also permanently remove legacy amounts of carbon in our atmosphere. And one piece I think relevant to this conversation too is that we can work locally and nationally to reduce the detrimental effects of pollution or habitat destruction or overfishing in the oceans, but fighting some of the bigger sea level rise or rising temperatures and ocean acidification really is going to require those global efforts tackling climate change and carbon removal. And so carbon removal is one part of that story, but a place that we're particularly far behind. It was estimated that in 2021, less than 10,000 tons had been durably removed. And so that's that tiny pixel in the kind of big span of that box, which is the roughly 3 to 6 billion tons that we're aiming for from climate models to remove each year by 2050. And so we have a few carbon removal solutions, and I actually see some carbon removal founders on the call, which is exciting. But the ones that do are typically pretty early on in their journey and also pretty expensive. And so we have this a little bit of a chicken and egg problem because of the cost, the tech risk, the lack of supply today. Most businesses that have climate commitments would rather buy low-cost alternatives, so temporary removal, avoided emissions offsets, or nothing at all. And without these customers, carbon removal approaches can't build up to reduce their costs. And so the kind of thesis coming in was, could we help speed up the development of some of these technologies today if instead of looking for kind of the cheapest tons we could find, we paid above market for promising technologies that had the potential to be low cost in the future, even if they weren't there necessarily today. And so in April of last year, a coalition of buyers launched Frontier, and it was structured as basically a future commitment for carbon removal purchasing. And the idea behind it is really to send a demand signal to researchers and entrepreneurs and investors to build that this is something that we need as a globe. And this is an idea that we worked with economists on from the vaccine development world and was put into play actually for pneumococcal. And so the intention was not to replace government or other mechanisms, but really to complement existing government R&D programs and to help speed up some of that learning by doing. And so the way that we work is that Frontier facilitates purchasing on behalf of buyer members. And we do this in two ways. The first are pre-purchases, so very, very small, early first purchases for the first pilot of an approach to help a company get started. And the second is a larger kind of like big multi-million-dollar offtake to pay for carbon removal if and when delivered over time. And that's for the companies that are really scaling up. And to decide which solutions to support, we built a set of target criteria with climate scientists to help characterize the types of solutions that we wanted to see more of. So approaches that store carbon durably, that aren't limited by arable land that we need for food systems, approaches that could be measured rigorously, deployed safely. And so this is the kind of rubric that we're using when we kind of think about what approaches to support. And I would say we are incredibly stubborn on this quality bar, but very, very, very agnostic on the approach. And we work with 60 external scientific experts, governance experts, marine scientists, biologists to assess projects against this bar. And so in the first really 18 months, Frontier facilitated purchases on behalf of about 30 companies. And this was everything from direct ocean removal to ocean alkalinity enhancement to enhanced weathering, but really kind of spanned the full scope. And I think this technology flexibility is really critical because each solution has real trade-offs. So if we think about DAC, right, high cost, a lot of energy consumption versus enhanced weathering, cheap, harder to measure. And so the aim with Frontier is to support the number of different solutions that balance some of these trade-offs and help us increase the likelihood that we have the portfolio of solutions we need in 2030. So that's kind of the backdrop there. I want to get into kind of the focus of today, which is why is marine carbon removal an area that we're super excited about, and how do we think about that in the context of MRV? So I think a number of reasons that against our criteria, ocean CDR is really exciting. I think ocean, largest carbon reservoir on Earth, a number of ways that you can work within the ocean system and harness natural processes that are already happening in the ocean. So growing algae, ocean currents, ocean buffering, to remove carbon. It also doesn't compete for land needed for food production, which is awesome. And I think one piece we sometimes under index on is that a lot of the carbon removal approaches we see in the ocean space as we're looking at our purchase program have a lot of potential benefits beyond carbon removal. So improving marine ecosystem health by mitigating ocean acidification locally, or producing clean hydrogen and energy alongside, or helping improve the way that we process wastewater, or creating new jobs in coastal communities. And then the last piece I would say is we see a lot that have a really interesting piece from a cost perspective, which is the ability to leverage some of the existing infrastructure already on coast. So think desalination plants or wastewater treatment centers to kind of help lower costs. And so this is the set of ocean companies that Frontier has supported to date. And there are a number of companies not here that other buyers like Shopify and Stripe, who are members of Frontier, have supported as well. But I'll highlight just a few because I think they are very cool. Banyu, for example, was built by marine chemists out of the University of Washington, and they use sunlight and a photo-triggered molecule to capture CO2 from seawater. We have Carbon Run, and they are a company that's focused on adding minerals in rivers to remove carbon while also improving salmon habitats in Canada. Vicarb, so they're an ocean alkalinity system that makes it easier to measure the amount of dissolved alkalinity that's added and the CO2 removed. And they're working with shellfish farmers and fisheries to help reduce the local impacts of acidification. We have Carboniferous. They're focused on sinking biomass in anoxic basins. And I could go down the list, but there are a number of really cool innovators who are thinking really critically about the way to responsibly deploy and build and test these solutions in the ocean. So to date, we've facilitated purchases from 5 carbon removal companies and 2 R&D grants. And I'll mention that these are very small pre-purchases. So the intention here is not purchasing big volumes or offtakes. These are paid up front to really support companies in building first pilots and furthering their research. And so kind of taking a step back, also, sorry, I'm losing my voice. I'm a bit sick. So if that's probably why you guys are hearing that on the line. But taking a step back as an early buyer, we feel a lot of the challenges acutely that Freya mentioned and walked through. With a lot of these approaches, it's hard to directly observe outcomes. There's a number of complex system interactions. And as a result, we recognize that modeling will play a role in quantifying removals and that there is going to be some inherent uncertainty. And so the way that we have approached this is that, while we think we should strive to reduce uncertainty as much as possible, 100% certainty isn't really a feasible end goal for all approaches. And from a climate perspective, it could be better to remove 10,000 tons with 70% confidence than to remove 1,000 tons with 90% confidence. And so if we think about open system approaches, anything where the CO2 stream isn't directly measurable and there are environmental interactions at play, so like many ocean removal approaches, these could kind of max out at medium quantification certainty. But some also have, as we talked about, like huge benefits on marine ecosystems, or could be really cheap long-term and a quicker path to scale. And so we think about MRV uncertainty and some of these questions as one of many factors to consider alongside cost, scale, ecosystem interactions, and the other criteria that I talked about earlier. And we also ask that anyone who's applying for a Frontier purchase identifies any of the kind of open questions in measurement for their approach, and they provide clear methods and models to measure those. And they also reflect in and discount their volume accordingly to make sure that they are addressing and appropriately making the right assumptions based on what we know today. But what I would say is that uncertainties also need to be characterized well enough so that we can discount for them accordingly in our measurement protocols. So Freya shared a little bit about the verification confidence diagram, and we think about right-sizing our purchasing based on this. So, for example, we wouldn't buy larger volumes, for example, unless we have higher confidence in the ability to quantify outcomes and have the right ecosystem monitoring and guardrails in place. And then the last piece I'll say is that kind of the philosophy that we have around MRV is that, and purchasing, is that we want to drive more funding to novel, promising CDR approaches that are directly tackling some of these measurement questions. And so we think a lot as we're looking at projects around how those specific projects or pilots will generate new data that we need to reduce uncertainty around field questions, to refine and validate models, to better quantify ecosystem interactions, build out better sensor networks. Like that is a core piece of how and when we choose to support an ocean solution. And so this is very much the theoretical level, I would say, and how we think about the philosophy. But I want to share a bit around what this looks like in practice for us as we think about our purchase process. And for those carbon removal founders who I see in the webinar today, who've been through this process, this probably feels deeply familiar. So if we look at the application step, verifiability or looking at MRV plans is really a cornerstone of our eligibility criteria and a big chunk of our application. So we ask a lot of questions around how are they thinking about measurement? How are you thinking about modeling? What different approach are you using? How are you accounting for X uncertainty? How are you using best available science? In diligence, each application receives 2 to 3 scientific reviews and a governance review. And it's something that we and our external team and internal team ask a lot of questions on. So I know we asked Carbon Run a lot of questions around how they think about downstream leakage in their solution. And then I would say also relevant here is for Ocean CDR, our governance reviewers spend a lot of time assessing whether companies have thoughtfully partnered with local communities to shape their deployment plans, whether they've considered environmental justice implications, whether they've identified potential health and ecosystem risks, and have a clear plan to monitor and mitigate those. And I know we're not explicitly in scope for MRV, but I think an important piece to make sure that we cover in terms of assessing carbon removal technologies, because it is a place where we often get questions on how we think about that for Ocean CDR. And happy to chat about that more. So the projects that we select may not have had everything figured out when we make a purchase, but I would say the ones that we showed are all thinking really critically about these pieces if it's one that we're going to support at an early stage. One example that comes to mind is an ocean company that in their application had just an extremely detailed research agenda of every single field experiment and question they were looking to answer in the next 2 years. And so that's the type of depth that we're hoping to see for these companies who are leading the field in removal. And then the next piece is contracting. So these are all, as I mentioned, really small volume contracts in oceans today, not about the tons, but whether this could be kind of a step change in our understanding of whether this plays a role in the 2030 portfolio. And so in contracting, we'll often include really specific and detailed milestones around different technical or governance progress we want to see, and that includes MRV. So we might ask for their support in developing stronger quantification approaches, or a public sharing of a scientific publication, or transparent publishing of different data. And then once the project is up and running, we also expect projects to provide ongoing reports of this data in the field and their work. And then lastly, we do require an independent verifier to audit and transparently report outcomes before we'd mark a contract as delivered. And so that's a bit around kind of how that looks and plays out in our purchasing process. I also want to touch on one piece. This is another question that we get asked, which we talk a little bit about the fact that many of these ocean approaches are early and there are these open questions. And so if MRV is really tough and that's where we are, why serve as a purchaser versus an R&D funder if we don't know everything yet? And I would say that our position is that purchasing can be a critical tool to support responsible innovation, jumpstarting policy ambition, helping build alignment across buyers on different criteria-based incentives, and really helping speeding up getting that data in the field that we need to get sharper on our measurement processes and our modeling. And one kind of stat that I'll pull in is that we surveyed our most recent purchase cohort just to get a sense of what is the impact of a purchase on you. And 94% of the founders said that a purchase from Frontier had accelerated their trajectory in some way, by pulling forward research, pulling forward pilot building, field trials, hiring better talent sooner, securing new project partners. And so that's the type of kind of pulling forward that we're hoping for with the program. Luckily, I would say, though, we are not in isolation, and we are really lucky to be part of a much broader and holistic ecosystem of players who are also thinking a lot around what it means to be in the space today, how we address all of these challenges in terms of thinking about measurement. And so to highlight a few, I think, obviously our host, Ocean Visions, is one. Seaworthy, they're a really neat organization who's building better open source MRV tools. Carbon to Sea, who's helping build out some of that connected scientific infrastructure and field trial network for alkalinity trials. Folks at American University or Columbia University, Will Burns, Romney Webb, who are thinking really deeply around responsible governance and policy frameworks. Carbon 180, other NGOs who are thinking about community engagement. And there's also, I've been in this space, not as long as many folks have been in this space, but I have been in the space a couple of years, and I keep meeting new organizations that are tackling this. So last week, I chatted with a company that was basically doing climate modeling downscaling for the ocean and focused on understanding ecosystem impacts and creating a habitat index based on different interventions. And so that to me is really energizing to see the number and depth of folks that are tackling this. And so I'll just wrap by saying, yes, we have a lot to figure out in ocean carbon removal, but I think this is really the decade to do that work and to figure out what works and to support responsible research, testing, and deployments today so that we can better evaluate the different approaches and determine which will be a part of that portfolio in 2030 at scale tomorrow. We're really excited for the discussion and open to questions.
Thank you both so much for your fantastic sort of primer on MRV for ocean-based CDR. I think it's so helpful to hear about just the basics of what that is, what are the key sort of opportunities in the ocean space, as well as the key challenges that you both touched on as well. Joanna, there you are, got you back. As well as how this sort of market approaches can, from a really broad view, advance rigor in the field. And so we're really, really happy to have you both join us. So we did get some questions in the chat, and I'm going to start with, we'll try to hit first on ones that came in from the audience. And we have a few that I think we would appreciate both of your commentary on, and then a few were specifically for one person based on what you said in your presentation. So just to start, I would like to ask both of you, what are your thoughts on first party versus third party MRV?
Where to start? I mean, I think basically you need a system in which there are checks and balances. Historically in carbon markets, you had a system where you have someone called a third-party verifier who comes and just checks to make sure you're following the rules. We haven't had a lot of checks to make sure the rules are right. So I think in this emerging marine CDR space, there are a couple of kind of third-party checks that we would want. One, I think we want some sort of infrastructure that is grounded in science and is really saying like, yes, this is the most rigorous way we can think of right now that is practical and rigorously quantifies outcomes. That's a very scientific check. I think you might also imagine some sort of third party making sure that a practitioner follows those rules. And I would really kind of differentiate those as two different important things that we need here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would add to that, Freya. I think we're very, very much on the same page on that one. I think today a lot of buyers are kind of in the market, especially, us as Frontier, of doing kind of bespoke diligence upfront on measurement plans because we're often a first buyer, doing really bespoke review on the back end of data and methodologies and all of the kind of ins and outs of a company's plan to decide whether to accept delivery. But that's only feasible because of the large scientific network that we work with and because of how kind of small these purchases are. That is not a tenable structure, I think, for a broader market or for an average buyer. And so I think long term, we definitely need to be in a space, and something we'll require as well, third-party verification and review of those outcomes of operational data. And as Freya said as well, more standardization of what those methodologies look like so that we have consistency in terms of whether a ton is a ton from OAE versus direct ocean removal versus DAC. We have kind of that streamlined set.
Great, thank you both. This question is a little bit, well, it's related to the issue of uncertainty, which you both touched on a lot, just recognizing that uncertainty is an inevitable part of this picture, and it's something that we are moving forward, accepting that this is going to be here. Are there different perspectives among stakeholders on how to deal with uncertainty? And then for Joanna, is that something that Frontier addresses in its relationships with buyers?
You want to kick off, Joanna?
Yeah, happy to. Yeah, I think that is definitely something that people think about differently. I think you have some folks in the market that would say certain solutions today are ready for buying at scale versus others would say, oh, wait, we don't quite know enough around, we haven't quite characterized the system yet to be able to responsibly discount volumes and understand the impact of that on measurement. And so I think you really do have not a monolith in terms of the perspectives there. I think that rings true as well for Frontier. We are a coalition of buyers, and I think we're lucky that everyone in the group is really spiritually aligned on supporting carbon removal and flexible in what that means. But that also means that we do a lot of work to figure out where is the state of science and what does that mean for where we can get comfortable. So how do we think about building rubrics for assessing different measurement methods, or how do we think about what the ecosystem risk looks like for a pathway if we haven't bought at bigger scales? We spend a lot of time having those conversations to make sure that we feel like we are holding true to our target purchase criteria that I shared. But yeah, I would say there are definitely different perspectives there depending on who you talk to.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think there is consensus in the emerging ocean carbon removal ecosystem that characterizing uncertainty is critical. I would contrast that, for instance, to a lot of activity in conventional carbon markets where we have not had good quantifications of uncertainty. So I think that's really positive, that baseline, I think, is pretty accepted among practitioners, among scientists, and among buyers. How exactly that gets folded into decision-making, I don't think there is a ton of clarity around whether that decision-making is about purchasing, whether it's about appropriate scale for purchasing, whether it's about funding research, whether it's about differentiating between carbon removal uncertainty and ecosystem uncertainty. There are a lot of questions there. And I think, yeah, a lot of conversations to have about how to navigate uncertainty.
Great, thank you. It'll be interesting to see how that develops over the next few years, and if we see consensus being reached in certain ways or not. So we did have a couple of questions on science, more sort of science related, and this one is for both of you, and then I have one for Freya after. Will sustained MRV assess impacts and co-benefits? Both of you talked about potentially negative impacts as well as benefits and risks, and then balance these against sort of the benefit or the objective of carbon removal? And is that going to be done, or how, considering the amount of observation that would really be needed to characterize all of that?
I think the answer is it depends how we define the goals of MRV. Maybe stepping back, I think sometimes we can conflate MRV and research. There is a lot of research to be done. MRV right now can be a process for helping us learn. It's not the only process for helping us learn. But fundamentally, like what MRV will look like in the long run is up to us. And we can decide whether it's really focused on carbon removal because we have done enough research about ecosystem impacts that we're comfortable. We could decide that there are some pieces of ecosystem monitoring, perhaps at kind of the local site of, introducing alkalinity or removing carbon that we want to require on an ongoing basis. But yeah, just stressing like MRV is a process for quantifying the things we decide we need to quantify on an ongoing basis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would add on to that we absolutely want to quantify both the carbon removal outcomes and confirm that we aren't, having negative ecosystem effects with those projects. I think there's kind of differing views on where that sits, whether that is part and parcel of a project protocol or not. I've seen both ways. And regardless of the mechanism, though, I think we want to have very clear standards and protocols for making sure that the right ecosystem indicators are monitored. And I think the other question was a great one, which is how do you weigh and how do you think about the trade-offs of the benefit to the climate and removing carbon and getting to the scale that we need to mitigate all the catastrophic effects of climate change with the potential downturn risk of an unknown ecosystem reaction that we might not have full clarity on what that looks like. And so I think that's one place where the community needs to kind of build out, and we're in those conversations as well, but needs to build out better frameworks and guardrails for what that looks like. So if we know that there's a risk that something might have a really negative effect, but we won't know it for 100-year time scale, that's probably not worth taking the risk. That wouldn't be responsible. Versus if there's something that if we can understand the impacts pretty well over a live basis as it goes, or it's pretty well contained, then we might make that trade-off and do a contained deployment or project. And so I think building in those right stage gates around purchasing, around research, and the expectations around what should be measured for ecosystem and quantification is really important to get right.
Great, thank you. Okay, I think, let's see. Just one more question on the science. So Freya, you mentioned that tools aren't always readily accessible. Instrumentation might not be necessarily very available to do some of this work, but that it could also contribute to, I guess, scientific co-benefits. Can you explain more about what off-the-shelf usable tools might look like and what you meant by that?
Yeah. If people aren't familiar with the organization Seaworthy, it might be worth checking out. Seaworthy is, I know David is in the chat, so he should define their organization in its own words, but really a focused research organization, nonprofit, focused on taking the modeling capacity we already have and creating a framework that is readily accessible to people who are not expert modelers nor expert ocean scientists. So that kind of like translation work, making things fit for purpose and ready to use, is something that takes a lot of work and investment. And that doesn't just go for modeling. I think it's also true in terms of like, well, a lot of people who didn't do their PhDs in ocean science might be trying to do local sampling or monitoring of alkalinity or PCO2 or whatever else. So what do we need to do either in standards or in terms of improving technology and accessibility of best practices to make sure that's done well? So that's really the like gap of like, how do we take all this stuff we already have and make sure it's actually used well.
Fantastic, thank you. Next question for Joanna. How do companies decide to make these purchases, and how do they de-risk their investments?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say right now, at least the pre-purchase stage, these are at risk. So these are focused more on innovation and accelerating the companies than on trying to get a specific volume of tons back. So that's for pre-purchases. Those are $500,000 out the door today. We hope that all those companies are successful. We know they might not be. And then offtakes are a little bit of a different payment model. So those are carbon removal contracts that are paid if and when carbon removal is delivered. So you might tie up capital in a contract, but you wouldn't actually pay anything out the door until the carbon is removed. So we have a offtake with Charm, for example, and we won't pay for removal until that happens. And the other thing I was just going to flag, Liana, maybe should have said this earlier. Freya and I are not ocean biogeochemists. We are not ocean PhDs. And so I'm wearing the hat as an early buyer in this space who knows a little about a lot, but not a lot about this specific vertical. And so there are many smarter people on this call who know a lot more about the ecosystem interactions, the timescales, who are building these frameworks and the tools that we need. So we should have led with that.
Thank you. Yeah, and I understand. This was meant to be a big picture webinar, and I think that you both gave fantastic presentations and very, very informative. And I'll call this out later, but we're planning to do a second MRV webinar that does dig in a little bit deeper with scientists on who are working on these solutions. Okay, let's see. We just have a couple of minutes left for questions, and I'm going to look at my screen here and see what else we need to ask. Okay, so I know what you just said about timescales, but we did have a question on what timescales, what time horizons should we be thinking about, and not necessarily from that deep scientific perspective, but can you comment on the timescales that are being considered, the timescales that you think should be considered, and if there's differing perspectives on that, how are those approached? And it might be similar to your response to the uncertainty question, but what's your perspective on the timescale question?
Oh, timescales and carbon removal, really important. So from the carbon perspective, like when we are thinking of carbon removal that can compensate for ongoing CO2 emissions, we are committing ourselves to thinking about very, very long timescales. When we put CO2 in the atmosphere, it affects global temperatures for millennia. That means if we are trying to claim we are undoing that impact, we have to be thinking about very, very long scale storage and the processes that might affect it. So that's one lens there. We are not going to be monitoring for millennia. So that's more of a structural lens on like, can this thing that we are proposing, ocean alkalinity enhancement, biomass sinking, whatever else, like, do we think it will actually store carbon on timescales that are commensurate to CO2 emissions in the atmosphere? So that's like one layer of considering timescales. Second layer is like practically in MRV, what are the timescales over which we expect people to be actively doing monitoring? I think that varies by approach. Yeah, a couple of interesting ideas to pull in there. Like one is this idea that like maybe you can observe the system for a certain amount of time, and then you have relative confidence that it reaches a stable state, that you've observed most of what you want to see. It might change past that threshold, but that will kind of ignore those changes. So an example of that might be a lot of these approaches that rely on air-sea gas exchange. You might get, 80% of the air-sea gas exchange, i.e. carbon removal, that you would expect in the first year. And that last 20%, we might decide like, that's just going to take way too long. We're going to kind of set that aside, imagine that it might happen as a bonus sometime far in the future, but the MRV process is really focusing on kind of a shorter timescale. And then the last kind of time scale question that Joanna invoked earlier is really about thinking about unintended consequences, unknown unknowns, how those might emerge at different scales, how quickly we are scaling. That's a much more amorphous set of questions that touch on time. No single best practice, but I think we would behoove ourselves to always think farther out than our first instinct.
Agree. Thank you. Joanna, did you have any comment on that?
No, I think you covered it well, Freya. Like, I think there's a number of different dimensions on the MRV, on the functional stability of the project, and the like long-term CO2 removal timeline that we're thinking about, and juggling all of those in terms of how we think about project assessment and the measurement protocols that we're putting in place.
Thank you. All right, so we just have 1 or 2 minutes left. We're going to go ahead and close the Q&A. Really appreciate the audience engagement here. I personally learned a lot from both the presentations and the Q&A, and thank you both to the speakers for your insightful and thoughtful answers on what came in. So I'm going to share my screen, our last slide. Yeah, and I think I'll just comment that from the Ocean Vision's perspective, we are a network organization working across sectors, and it's always nice to hear. It's always nice to have speakers coming from different perspectives and sectors, and hear also your experience with what these different sectors are doing, how they're working together. As we said, there's so much momentum now around ocean-based CDR and MRV that there's really a role for everyone to play. So loved hearing about that from both of you, and thank you so much. Okay, we're going to go ahead and close the webinar. Thank you everyone who has attended. I'm so excited that we sold out this webinar and got a fantastic primer on what MRV for ocean-based CDR is and kind of big picture approach to advancing that rigor. We are planning a second MRV webinar right now featuring a couple of those startups, some of them that Joanna mentioned, to talk a little bit more about the science and innovations in science that are happening in current challenges. So if you would like to stay tuned, please join us. That'll be late November or early December. Joanna and Freya, thank you so much. And I hope everybody has a great afternoon, and see you next time.